welcome back. My name is Don K. Preston. All right, I've been sharing with you, and look, what I've been sharing with you is such a critical element of understanding resurrection. The resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 is the resurrection of Romans 8:18 and following. Extremely few commentaries and commentators deny that. In Romans chapter 8, Paul spoke of the then present suffering that he and the first century church was experiencing. And he called that the birth pains. This common motif that is found throughout the Old Testament that virtually all Jewish commentators relate to the end times. In Jewish eschatology, the narrative was that you would have the appearance in the last days of the coming of Elijah. You would have the Great Tribulation, you would have the falling away or the apostasy, and then the resurrection at the coming of the Lord, the judgment, and the kingdom. What I've shared with you is throughout the Old Testament, we find that exact pattern. Look, the Jewish rabbis didn't just make this up, all right? And I know some people are liable to say, well, it's just what the Jews believe. Well, you know what? Did the Jews misunderstand the nature of the kingdom? Yes, they did. Did they get every single thing wrong? No, they did not. And that's a misnomer. It's a misunderstanding. And so when people say, well, okay, yeah, the Jews believe this or that, but after all, it was the Jews and they didn't know anything. No, the Jews knew plenty, thank you very much. And this narrative of end-time suffering and the Great Tribulation leading directly to the resurrection is absolutely critical. I shared with you the narrative from Matthew 24. Look, I used to not see any connection between Matthew 24 and 25 and the resurrection, except, you see, at the time I believed that Matthew 24 was divided. Verses 4 to 34, that all applied to the events leading up to and consummating in the Lord's coming in AD 70 and judgment of Israel. Okay, I accepted that. But, at verse 36, where Jesus said, but of that day and hour knows no man, I was convinced that was, as one writer put it, that's the continental divide of the Olivet Discourse. And after Matthew 24:36, certainly that's about the quote, end of time. That's about the resurrection, particularly chapter 25, verse 31 and following. Well, the more that I've studied, the more that I've come to see, understand, realize, and understand the Old Testament connection, source, and background to Matthew 24 and 25, number one, the more I've come to realize Matthew 24 is not divided. It is a singular discourse about one event. The end of the age, the coming of the Lord at the fall of Jerusalem. That's what the disciples understood. And no, they were not confused. And I've come to understand that, guess what? I want you to listen to me very carefully. I want you to catch the power of this. The resurrection is foretold, if we follow the Jewish narrative, is foretold in Matthew 24, verses 4 through 34. Now look, folks, if you take the view that Matthew 24, 4 to 34 is about the fall of Jerusalem, all right? Then if you accept this Jewish narrative, and if you more specifically accept the relationship between the Great Tribulation and the resurrection, which I've shared with you in video after video now, then guess what? It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the resurrection is predicted in Matthew 24, 4 to 34, and that means the resurrection was to occur in the first century at the fall of Jerusalem at AD 70. Now watch this. I shared with you that what we find in Matthew 24, verse 8, the beginning of the birth pangs. Well, Paul said the whole creation groans in birth pangs until now. Those birth pangs are related to the end times in passage after passage that I've shared with you. Jeremiah chapter 30, Hosea 13 and 14, Micah chapter 4 and chapter 5, Jeremiah 31 and following. Okay? Matthew 24, verse 8, the beginning of the birth pangs. Number 2, the abomination of desolation. Number 3, the great tribulation. And immediately following the tribulation of those days, the sun would be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars of heaven shall fall, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken, and they shall see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Now watch this, Matthew 24, verse 31. And the Son of Man shall send forth his angels with the sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together the elect from the four winds. Did you know? Look, I didn't know this until, a couple of years ago. Did you know that the Jewish rabbis believe that Isaiah 27, verse 13, was a prediction of the last days, coming of the Lord, the sounding of the great trumpet for the resurrection? Let me read that for you, shall we? It shall be in that day. Now I'll get to that day in a moment. The great trumpet will be blown. They will come who are about to perish in the land of Assyria. They who are outcast in the land of Egypt. They shall worship the Lord in the holy mount at Jerusalem. Now watch. The commentators are agreed. Jesus in Matthew 24:31 is drawing directly from Isaiah 27, verse 13. Boy, watch the beauty of this. Isaiah 27:13 is the prediction of the resurrection in the day Leviathan would be destroyed, at the coming of the Lord to vindicate the saints. Isaiah 26:20 and 21, at the time of the resurrection. Isaiah 26:21 and following. I believe that's right. No. Verse 17 and following, the time of the tribulation, followed by the resurrection. Do you follow that? Do you catch that? Isaiah 26 and 27. The time of trouble, the resurrection, at the coming of the Lord, at the sounding of the great trumpet to gather together the elect. Those are the constituent elements of Matthew 24. The coming of the Lord, sounding of the trumpet, the gathering of the elect. Now, when would that take place in Matthew 24? This generation will by no means pass until all of these things are fulfilled. Matthew 24, verse 34. That's in the judgment of Jerusalem. Now watch. Isaiah 27:12. Sounding of the great trumpet, 12 and 13. Sounding of the great trumpet for the gathering of the elect. When would it be? In that day. In what day? In what day? In the day in which the fortified city would be destroyed, in which the altar would be turned to chalkstone, in the day when the people whom the Lord had created would no longer find mercy. That is AD 70. So here's Isaiah 26 and 27, prediction of the time of distress, the time of suffering, the time of the resurrection, at the coming of the Lord, in the destruction of Jerusalem, the time of the sounding of the great trumpet for the resurrection. Here we have Matthew 24, the time of distress, time of the great tribulation, the coming of the Lord, the sounding of the great trumpet for the resurrection. When would it be? In Jesus' generation. Now look, folks, Isaiah 26 and 27 is part of what's known as that little apocalypse that Jesus and the New Testament writers quote over and over and over again to predict the end times. So here is Isaiah 26 and 27 with every constituent element of Matthew 24, 4 to 34, including the resurrection. And we're supposed to see no connection between Matthew 24, 4 to 34, and the resurrection. Now, I'm sorry, that doesn't work. Watch this. Isaiah 27:13, prediction of the sounding of the great trumpet at the time of the resurrection, at the destruction of Jerusalem. But Jesus quoted Isaiah 27:13 in Matthew chapter 24, verse 31, to predict his coming in the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Therefore, Jesus is coming at the sound of the great trumpet, for the resurrection was at the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Well, we've got more. So we'll see you on the flip side.